I'm going to hand over now to Professor Geir Lundestad, whom I don't need to introduce to anybody in this room, I think, is a distinguished historian, former secretary of the Nobel Committee, and floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be introduced both by you and by Espen. It's indeed true that I do not believe that history repeats itself. I mean, we hear this constantly from those who are not historians, that history repeats itself. And then, of course, they select the very facts from history. History is boundless, but they select the few facts which fit into their predetermined conclusions. Don't believe this. History is so full of complexities that it's impossible to decide in advance what are the relevant parallels. Point one. Point two, I have for more than half my life been a professor of history, and there I have indeed made predictions, tons of predictions, but mostly about the past. It's very difficult to make predictions about the future, and I've discovered that my predictive powers are rather limited. But I've also discovered that the media have only one interest, that is the future. If you want to say something on television or in the media, you have to say something about the future. The intellectual, honest answer is, of course, I have no idea, but then you will never appear anywhere saying anything about anything. So I am going to make a prediction. I'm going to make the prediction that NATO will indeed continue for two various obvious reasons. One, of course, is that it's impossible to get rid of organizations once they are established. Clausewitz said this explicitly. There's endless friction in international relations. Yes, indeed there are. When I heard the Admiral say that there will be constant change and great change in all areas, this is not my experience with bureaucracy, I must say. I must say. But I can only wish you luck. So NATO will continue primarily because of friction, but also because NATO makes eminent sense. I mean, even the group that has come to power in Washington, I mean, they can make all kinds of stupid mistakes, but they will understand certain basic things. And the basic thing here is that the major one advantage, maybe the major advantage the United States has in international relations is the number and the strength of its allies. I mean, if you don't get that, it's just so obvious. The other point is, of course, that there will continue to be crises in NATO, because there's always been crisis in NATO. I remember, I read these books where they talk about the golden years. There have never been golden years. Just another major crisis. I've written 2 books on this topic. There's always just another major crisis. Let me just enumerate a few of them to remind you. The origins of NATO. I'm sick and tired of reading all these American books about how the United States founded NATO. Not true. Britain, yes. Certainly the leading role belonged to Britain and Foreign Secretary Bevin. And it took quite a bit of persuasion to get the Americans to agree to an Atlantic Security Organization. Then Article 5 was very difficult, formulation of Article 5. German rearmament and the European army, for goodness sake. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles talked about an agonizing reappraisal. He threatened to pull out if the Europeans did not establish a European army. Of course, nobody believed the threat, because the US had a tremendous self-interest in NATO. Yes. Then we had the 60s with de Gaulle pulling out of the military structure, a huge crisis. We had the 70s with Vietnam and Ostpolitik and Richard Nixon's hang-ups about Germany and German Social Democrats and Ostpolitik. We had the 80s with, remember, that nuclear abolitionist, Ronald Reagan, for goodness sake, when he met with Gorbachev in Reykjavik, and they came very close to ending nuclear weapons. I mean, this was a major crisis. Margaret left for Washington instantly. And Mitterrand, of course, also saw this as a very, very serious crisis. So there's always been a crisis in NATO, always. But NATO has always survived. And of course, in the Cold War, there was a deeper reason, and the deeper reason was expressed better than anyone by Lord Ismay, when he said that NATO was formed to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. Yes. Then, of course, came the end of the Cold War. And the realists in political science, I know many of you, probably too many of you, have studied political science, and you believe in some of this stuff. And the realists said that no alliance has survived the disappearance of the threat against which the alliance was directed. And this was a law, to the extent that there are laws. Well, what happened with NATO? Well, of course, there were new crises, but NATO continued, took in new members, and it's alive and kicking. I remember I attended a seminar, kind of an elite seminar in Washington, with the father of neorealism, Ken Walls. And we asked Ken, I mean, NATO has, after all, continued. What's the explanation? And the father of neorealism went into an harangue against Bill Clinton, who had destroyed the laws of political science realism. Bill Clinton had undertaken all these actions to keep NATO alive, and he had succeeded. Well, you could lose confidence in political science reasons realism for smaller reasons than that. And here we are with Donald Trump and his gang. We are already one down. We got rid of Mike Flynn. Thank you. If we could also get rid of Steve Bannon, I think it will take some more time. We could see some relatively favorable developments in Washington. I mean, here is a president who called his movement America First. Without knowledge of history, America First was the movement that worked against American participation in World War II. He didn't know this, of course, but it is America First, and make America great again. And he has said all these stupid things about many important subjects in international relations. But sense is already beginning to kick in. Sense is already beginning to kick in. I mean, we had this series of executive orders, which, to a surprising degree, delivered on his electoral promises. But on the main subjects, I see movement. He has already retreated on One China. I mean, he made these statements and he made this telephone call, but he has admitted that there's only one China. Big piece. He has retreated on what he said on Japan. Shinzo Abe, I mean, he has visited and talked so much. He got his wishes fulfilled. And he has already said other things about NATO. And the State Department and the Defense Department are beginning to kick in. I mean, in the early days, when only Mike Flynn and Steve Bannon were present for the meetings and telephone conversations. My goodness, I mean. But now bureaucracy is kicking in full strength. And of course, they all come to Europe, Pence, Tillerson, Mattis, they come to Europe, and they will, of course, deliver the expected statements. They will say nice things about NATO. That's why they come. So I think the crisis in that sense is already over, but we'll see. But there will have to be changes. NATO will continue. Almost all organizations do continue. And there are very few examples of organizations being dissolved. There's the Warsaw Pact, but we understand why it was dissolved. But there aren't really that many other examples. The League of Nations was dissolved, but on the same day they created the United Nations. And the same thing has happened in international trade. One organization abolished and a new one arises. There will be insistence, and there should be insistence on the Europeans doing more. But this complaint has been constant. I remember Eisenhower. In 1953, he had been the commander, supreme commander of NATO. He gave this speech, and he said, I put it a bit more bluntly, but the point is very clear. He said, I'm sick and tired of giving all this money to the Europeans and they doing nothing in return. And the more money I give them, the more they criticize me. This was Eisenhower, 1953. And it's been constant. It's been constant. Of course, Washington has constantly complained. But NATO does make excellent sense. I mean, there was opposition to NATO when NATO was founded. And this has remained with the far right, that it's bad to be in NATO because it limits American sovereignty. Well, of course it limits American sovereignty, but it also gives the United States tremendous power. Tremendous power. And I think this is beginning to dawn, and those who have worked with NATO, they know this. So, NATO will indeed continue. It will be alive and kicking, but there will be new crises, and the constant theme of financing will play a much larger role, as it should. I mean, it's embarrassing. The European role is quite simply embarrassing in all this. I mean, many of these countries are much richer than the US on a per capita basis, and they should be able to come up with 2% of GDP. So, but it will take hard work, and there will be other crises as well. Thank you.